Hello and welcome to another Unstress. My name is Dr. Ron Ehrlich. Before I start, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I am recording this podcast, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. The science in medicine is our topic today, and I'm talking to my guest today is Todd Penberthy. Todd has a PhD in research, in scientific research. He's a science writer. His subjects of interest include diabetes, oncology, integrative psychiatry, which is what we touch on in this podcast. We talk a lot about the power of a particular nutrient. I won't spoil it for you on psychiatry, and it's alerted and reminded me of its importance. We also talk about one of the legends in integrative psychiatry and orthomolecular medicine, Dr. Abram Hoffer, a name that you will be familiar with when we through this podcast. And also we touch on a neurodegenerative disease, and as an example, multiple sclerosis. And what an interesting discussion that is when we compare a pharmaceutical approach to an orthomolecular or biochemical or vitamin approach, if you like, and compare the efficacy and the costs. And this, again, is a great model for how we are dealing with so many diseases in our modern world. So I hope you enjoyed this conversation I had with Todd Penberthy. Welcome to the show, Todd.
Glad to be here.
Todd, you are a science writer and researcher, and I'm just intrigued, and you cover quite a few areas, in particular, diabetes and sleep disorders, which is something we're very focused on in our podcast as well. In fact, the list of things that you're interested in are things we've covered before, so I'm interested there. But how does one become a science writer? Well, tell us a little bit about your journey.
Basically, I started out in developmental biology and biochemistry and zebrafish as an animal model, and then it in academia it's kind of a begging game after a certain point, and my wife managed to get out of the labs and become a regulatory writer, which is bread and butter, writing things for the FDA, and then I remember now. I found a course. Her name is Emma Hitt, Hitt. She's near Atlanta, Georgia, and she still offers the course. And she really taught me everything to get out of the lab and get into, at the time, my first project was writing a huge document about a fairly new medical technology. It was laser therapy for endometriosis. And so you review all the clinical trials, the quality of the trials, and the whether the insurance covers it, all this kind of stuff. And then I started to learn about how you can become a journalist going to medical conferences. And since I live in Orlando, where the whole planet wants to come to, I could advertise my services at the proper boards, and then the next thing you know, I'm attending, like multiple sclerosis meetings, which is my own personal favorite disease that I believe is expected to be exceptionally responsive to high dose niacin therapy. And then it just took off from there in so many directions. And then I eventually got into, helping with courses for physicians for all kinds of different therapeutic areas.
It sounds like a little bit of a revelation, because with research, medical research, you can go down you can learn more and more about less and less. And here you are exploring the broader field. So almost a liberation, really, isn't it, to get out there and say, hey, I don't have to do this anymore. I can go and find anything.
Absolutely, because when you're in academia, you have to carve your unique niche and become the expert in whatever it is. And it just gives my life so much more meaning on so many levels. My mom is almost 80, and I basically hoard digital notes from the orthomolecular news service and from the standard of care medicine that I get exposed to, and all of the guidelines that I constantly get exposed to, and the realities, the safety concerns for so many conditions. Yes, it is absolutely liberating and meaningful, meaningful work.
Yeah. I mean, you and I, how we have actually met, although this is our first real meeting, but we've exchanged many emails through the orthomolecular news service that we're both, I think, honoured to be on the editorial board on. I think we both say that we were talking about that unequivocally before we came on air, and it's got such an incredible group of people, many of whom I've had on as guests. But it must be interesting for you going to these scientific, these medical conferences, dealing with MS, dealing with diabetes, dealing with cancer, and hearing all of the wonderful drugs that are out there and the different processes, and yet also being a member of the orthomolecular news service, which basically, to the ordinary listener, is about using nutrients to promote optimal biochemistry in each and every one of our cells. So that's it in a nutshell. How does it compare when you sit there and you listen to these conferences? Is there much talk of biochemistry and what actually is going wrong and how we could fix it?
I would say, it is tried. This is coming from my own kind of philosophy of medicine, but I would say that is what they try to present it as. And a lot of times, yes, they are figuring out mechanisms of pathogenesis that are very good to know. It's just when you look at it critically and with concern for safety first, and the fact that every new drug doesn't have any long-term safety studies by definition because it's new. I'm generally critical of pharmaceutical approaches. Generally, I know that sometimes it's required. Feel gratitude for the basic research that they do and all that.
Yeah. Well, when we talk about the science in medicine, the gold standard is really the randomized controlled trials, aren't they?
Yeah.
Can you just give us basic 101 what a randomized control trial is, just to remind our listener, because they would hear it a lot, and I think it'd be interesting just to go back to some basics.
Okay, my understanding is that the gold standard currently for it is a double-blinded randomized controlled trial. So double-blinded means that neither the doctors administering the drug nor the patients receiving the drug have any idea what the treatment is. And sometimes it's impossible because there's an inherent activity for the drug that, but anyways, that's the gold standard. And then it's, so it's randomized that in that fashion. And the controls are, I think, sometimes untreated. I think they're not usually involving necessarily the best treatment. I think they're often involving kind of no treatment, or just salt pill or something that's not going to have any particular effect, and they just have to show some kind of positive outcome. Is my understanding.
Yeah, and
I don't know if I answered your question.
But. Yeah, no, that's fine. And another one that I don't think we hear enough about is the difference between a relative risk and an absolute risk. I mean, can you shed any light on the difference between those two?
Yeah, that's let's say you want to look at death from cardiovascular disease with statins, and I think roughly the numbers are if you have 200 high-risk people and then 2 die out of the high-risk people over a certain time window. But if you give them statins, then maybe 1 dies of that particular restricted indication. Then this can be described, although this is very misleading, and this is routinely done. And for many this is a huge misleading approach. They would describe that reduction from a data point, which is only 2 people becoming 1, as a 50% reduction. I guess if you got huge numbers, you would get more significant figures than really 2 becoming 1, maybe 25 or 30 becoming 15 or something. But the truth is that's an absolute reduction of, so it's not really a 50% chance that it's going to help you. It's actually 1 out of 100, 1 out of 200. So a 0.5% chance that it could help you with respect to cardiovascular disease, just a 0.5%. And when this all comes with the assumption that it is not perhaps causing you to die prematurely from some other side effect. So if you take the pill, and this is a huge problem, I think, with the vaccine right now, the whole lack of consideration and public transparency as far as the safety issues. But we don't have to go there necessarily.
I don't mind, Todd, if you don't mind. I don't mind. I think that actually is part of my question, really, because I've always seen the difference as the relative risk. So in your case, which you just mentioned, 200 people, 2 die of a heart attack, and then by giving the statin, only 1 dies. So the relative risk is 50% reduction in heart disease or death from heart attack. And that's a great way of marketing a product. And that's all. Actually, I've never heard anybody in this whole pandemic, let alone we could go down some of these other areas that you're of interest. I've never heard people talk about absolute risk. It's always a marketing tool, the relative risk. And what surprises me is so-called experts who are advising us constantly quote those marketing figures for the drug companies.
Yeah, basic point, and it's just the basics are missing with understanding that. It's true. Yeah, it is shocking. It's just
yeah. Now, when you're exploring areas, like you're talking, your multiple sclerosis is a particular area of interest for you. How big a problem is multiple sclerosis? What's happening out there in the world of? This is a serious neurodegenerative disease. What's happening? I've not really explored multiple sclerosis.
Yeah, I think there's something like 4 million people that have it, and I should know these numbers by now, but it is the most common autoimmune disease affecting the central nervous system. I'm actually working on courses for progressive multiple sclerosis and telemedicine, which has recently taken off with the COVID pandemic. So now it's increased like 100-fold the ability to do virtual medicine for people who are already having immune issues, this autoimmune disease. But as far as what's going on, there's several biologics and there's several small molecules that are being used. I provide a service with my writing, and I really enjoy it. Everything about it. But if I'm going to be frank about what I think works the best, for multiple sclerosis, if we wanted to go there,
we do. We always want to hear what is the best, Todd. This isn't about being politically correct. You can just relax and tell me exactly what you think.
Okay, thank you. Great. Yeah. So multiple sclerosis involves loss of the, your brain is actually the most fat dense organ in your body. It's full of fat, and to make those neurons, those excitable tissues conduct I guess it's probably electricity really in neurons, but nerve conduction. And so you lose that fat. You're losing the myelin because antibodies are going there, different cells are going in there and killing it. And to regenerate that myelin, all that fat, it requires an incredible amount of energy. You know, everybody knows from basic nutrition that fats have 9 kilocalories per gram, protein, nucleotides, protein and carbohydrates have 4 kilocalories per gram. And this is all fat, mostly fat actually in everybody's head, and you need a ton of energy to make it. So that requires, for example, NAD, which comes from niacin or niacinamide and vitamin B3 in a word. And it of course, magnesium is required in more than anything, and thiamine, and it gets to be pretty complicated as far as the autoimmune aspects. But in my proudest work, I can send it to anybody if they ever want it. In 2007, after getting to know Abram Hoffer and getting his mentorship, and also having been at Medical College of Georgia, where a guy named Andrew Meller and I'm blanking on the other guy, they discovered this enzyme. It's really interesting. It's called IDO, or indolamine 2,3 dioxinase. We'll just call it IDO. And it's made in the cells. So when a woman has a baby, when a woman has a baby, she is able to. It's the only time a human being can accept a foreign object, and it's in our body. And the way we do this is we. This is probably too hard. It's so hard to explain because it's pretty long. But around the baby, there's this enzyme that's made that depletes the extracellular tryptophan, and so the T cells, they're like kind of weak, and they cannot attack the foreign new baby. But if you inhibit that enzyme, then there's a lot more tryptophan, and the T cells go crazy. And they immediately abort the fetus. And so this is a basic mechanism for controlling the immune system. And it's been shown now in every single autoimmune disease, the tryptophan levels are low. And tryptophan is already the least abundant amino acid. And tryptophan is the only amino acid that you can make NAD from. So if you have somebody who's fasting for a real long time and they don't take any vitamins, the only way they're getting that NAD is from the tryptophan. It's a very important pathway. So in multiple sclerosis, it's been shown the brain levels that, so what it looks like is every single autoimmune disease almost looks like vitamin B3 deficiency that is anatomically localized to wherever the antibody is. So they've shown in the brain, NAD levels are low of multiple sclerosis patients. And in cancer, this whole thing is happening too. The T cells will make this IDO, and they can evade the immune system now because of that. So there's companies always trying to inhibit that enzyme as a chemotherapeutic. But so I think our original question was multiple sclerosis.
Yeah, well, it's interesting to hear you say that tryptophan is a common denominator in all autoimmune conditions, low tryptophan. And it's interesting also that there are over 100, I think there are 100 autoimmune conditions. So it's interesting to see that why would somebody get multiple sclerosis and someone else get rheumatoid arthritis and someone else get colitis? I mean, this is the genetic component perhaps, but there are common pathways in these conditions.
Yeah. So my understanding with that is that basically you have a situation where there's T cells that you want to get rid of these things because they're autoreactive T cells that are causing these different diseases, whether it's Graves' disease, MS, type 1 diabetes, or Sjogren's syndrome, or myasthenia gravis, or whatever it is. Your body is at that point trying to get rid of those T cells, is what I think is happening. So the body is making this enzyme that is depleting the tryptophan, so the T cells will not keep attacking you, just like your body makes this enzyme when a pregnant woman's body makes this enzyme in the cells, in the trophoblast cells, to stop the T cells from attacking. But when this happens over and over and over again, it's kind of like a pellagra, but it's localized to whatever the tissue is that's affected in the autoimmune disease. And so I think at the end of the day, this is a long, basic attempt to communicate, but at the end of the day, a lot of autoimmune diseases really respond well to sort of NAD therapies.
Which is focused on B3, vitamin B3.
Yes, and niacin is particularly exceptional because it has a completely separate from our this whole last 10 minutes of talk pathway. The flush pathway is completely different, and it has in its own right unique activities that are incredible for, actually, it turns out, multiple sclerosis and cardiovascular disease. It's that pathway is the one that corrects all the lipids, corrects your triglycerides, your VLDL, your HDL, your LDL, the LTA, all of them are corrected. Even your blood pressure are all corrected. Total cholesterol, all those can be corrected by high dose niacin. And that is not the case with the other vitamin B3s, not nicotinamide riboside, not nicotinamide mononucleotide, and not niacinamide, but niacin. And it's because the niacin has this separate pathway that is the flush pathway, which is just a whole nother exciting pathway. And again, with staying on the topic of multiple sclerosis, it's particularly one of the most amazing things to me is one of the most exciting drugs to a lot of people in multiple sclerosis is something called dimethyl fumarate. Its trade name is Tecfidera, Tecfidera. And that drug, it's an oral drug, it works by binding to the same receptor as niacin that causes the flush. And this blows my mind because, people have paid $5,000 a month for Tecfidera.
Yes.
And it's still sold, at really high prices when they could pay $5 a month for something that has not been withdrawn from the market previously because of safety issues, and Tecfidera has. In Europe, it was used for some skin things, and it had to be withdrawn. But it's being used now and sold for, huge amounts of money to multiple sclerosis patients. And the other entirely perfect characteristic of niacin for multiple sclerosis is the fact that it is a skeletal component of NAD, whereas dimethyl fumarate is just basically a monocarboxylate that activates that's the same flush causing pathway as niacin. I'm sorry if I didn't say that simply enough, but
no. Well, actually, you've said so much there because, firstly, you've mentioned Abram Hoffer, which we really should honour because he is the father, really, of orthomolecular medicine. And I don't think I'm speaking out of line there. I think most people would agree with me because I heard him speak in Australia in the 1980s. I did my first nutrition course in 1981. And he was out here in Australia doing the talk. So he's an absolute legend, and I know he focused a lot on B3, niacin, and thankfully even my cardiologist, Dr. Ross Walker, who's an integrative cardiologist, has had me on that too. It's quite a flush. You do get a flush. Is that the sign that you're at the right level, or do you just have to take time to get over that? You build up slowly with niacin, don't you?
Well, I think you want the flush. That's the right dose of niacin.
Okay.
Because then you're activating that pathway, and it's almost like, to me, it's like exercise. you want a certain amount of, but not too much. But niacin has such a huge safety profile that, you don't really have to worry about. We can talk about that too. But I think as far as dosing niacin, the best way to do it is to try to have at least 3 flushes a day. And it's really curious because you can have people who flush with as little as, the littlest I've known of, I think is 25 milligrams or 50 milligrams. And then you have other people that they can't flush, and they're more likely to be schizophrenic or to have a health issue that, according to a really good lipid chemist, Horobin, he says that's because there's a lack of some kind of fatty acids, some kind of prostaglandins, and the prostaglandins are definitely central to this pathway, PGE2 and PGD2.
And if 25 to 50 is the lower end of the scale, 25 to 50 milligrams, you were saying, oh, gee, some people have even had a flush. And by flush, it literally is a flush. Your face becomes red. That's the flush response. That's right,
Yeah.
isn't it? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so the most common dosage, I think, would probably be said to be maybe 1 gram taken 3 times a day. But I would never recommend someone just start like that unless they're like a very brave person. It startles. It can be startling to the uninitiated. I had one guy who, he came here from Vietnam. We used to call him Iron Man, and he was a stopper on my soccer team. And he was a tough guy, but he got Guillain-Barré syndrome, and I gave him a ton of niacin, and I thought he's Iron Man. So, but he took himself to the emergency room. He thought it was an allergic reaction. I tried to explain, but
Yeah, but it's not. It's passes. It is safe. It's a little disconcerting, I know, because I sometimes have a flush myself. Maybe I have a natural B3 level, but I know I did flush. But you mentioned something else there with that Tecfidera, because this happens so many times. We've seen it in the pandemic recently too. I mean, for example, you mentioned Tecfidera is $5,000 a month, and niacin, and that has all sorts of side effects. Apart from the financial cost, it has physical side effects which have prompted governments to withdraw it from use. And then you can get B3 niacin for $5 a month, and you are perfectly safe, and this is what actually the body needs, blah, blah, blah. And another comparison, we digress here for a moment, is the company Merck, who has a drug called ivermectin. And ivermectin has been pilloried by the press as being a horse dewormer, totally ignoring the fact that it won the Nobel Prize for Medicine in 2015 for humans.
Whoa.
Ivermectin. And I think it's a few dollars, yes, well, it is. But interestingly, the question was, why wouldn't Merck, promote this? It's off patent, it's not worth any money. But what they were doing was they were producing a similar drug called molnupiravir, which is $700 or $750 a dose of several capsules. So we have one that's worth $2 or $3 and one that's worth $750, manufactured from the same manufacturer. And here you give me an example in the multiple sclerosis world of Tecfidera versus niacin. I mean, this is what medicine has become, hasn't it?
Yeah. I firmly believe the profit motive doesn't belong in medicine, and it's just ruined everything. That's what I believe. The profit motive drives, advertising, and then it sort of sneaks its way into education and everybody's awareness, but it's not coming from an impartial scientific method, what works best. Yeah.
And when you're also interested in integrative psychiatry, is another area that you've mentioned, and you just touched on there, schizophrenia. If they don't get the flush response, that maybe there's an indication there. Tell us a little bit about your interest in integrative psychiatry, because we've touched on this topic before with a couple of our guests as well. So when I saw you were interested in that, what's your interest in that area?
Oh, thanks for asking. So, Abram Hoffer's the biggest influence in all my thinking, and he's sort of the grandfather of that whole field to me. And Jonathan Prowski has been carrying the torch there too, and Dr. Greenblatt and James Greenblatt, and psychiatry is a unique. A very challenging field of medicine, because there's no simple readout. You can't just look at the blood and say, something cardiovascular risk in your plumbing, like they do in cardiovascular, and kidney function, that has very straightforward metrics, for the nephrologists, and diabetes, straightforward metrics. But psychiatry, it's so hard. I mean, to have an unbiased, metric, and other than really, talking to people, we all understand sort of how hallucinogens, things like that, really affect our behavior. These chemicals, small molecules, and niacin and the whole vitamin B3 thing is particularly exciting there, because it's central to all the chemistry in clearance and metabolism, proper metabolism of dopamine, all the serotonin, all the neurotransmitters, and the associated schizotoxins like adrenochrome, which comes from some of these catecholamines. And then because the NAD that comes from niacin or any vitamin B3 is used in almost all of the cytochrome P450 enzyme reactions, that means all most drug metabolizing enzymes are dependent on the levels of NAD and the clearance of xenobiotics and toxins and pollutants and carcinogens and the things that affect our brain, whether it's alcohol, whether it's methamphetamines. So NAD levels are important to tapering off psychiatric meds, all these things. So that's where I guess my interest came from.
And again, this is about, actually what you're mentioning there is so important, isn't it? Because this is we're supposed to be practicing evidence-based medicine, and yet the evidence for using some of these drugs in psychiatry is very subjective, really. I mean, it's like, let's give a drug and see how it affects someone, because we literally have no blood test or other metric to measure. Like, is your blood pressure too high? Well, we need to lower it. Is your kidney function optimal? Well, we need to improve it. Are your blood vessels occluded? We need to clear it. When we come to the brain, when we come to psychiatry, there is no test for, these serotonin uptake inhibitors. Well, you'd think you'd be able to measure how effective that was, but you can't.
Yeah. And
I mean, it is laughable, except it's not very funny. I mean, so many people are on this medication. I mean, I've heard one statistic, Todd, and maybe you can tell me, about, you may not know this, but I think America, which has 5% of the world's population, consumes 50% of the world's psychotropic drugs. How's that for a statistic? Does that surprise you, sitting in Florida? I don't know.
No. Like I said, I feel like money drives, and I don't know. We have a very much a consumer culture here in America, where we just it's you know, with Amazon and everything, you can just click, and you know, we already have a consumer culture. Now we can just click, and and I think that sometimes with psychiatric issues, you know, what is success continues to be a question, because sometimes you have psychiatric problems, and it's not just a problem. When it's psychiatric, it's not always just a problem for the individual. It's people that have to live with them and all that, and then sedatives almost, I think, are almost appealing to the situation. But I don't know. I guess it's not. I don't know. I don't want to be too negative about just criticizing the whole thing, but it makes more sense to me to consider, you know, zinc, iron. I mean, just, you know, a lot of things with integrative psychiatry: niacin, thiamine, magnesium, vitamin D. Even all these things have psychiatric activities. Yeah.
And tell me, you have obviously had this contact with Abram Hoffer on a personal level. Tell us a little bit about him. What you know? Give us. I've mentioned the name, and I've acknowledged his role, but tell us a bit about him. What was he like? What was it like being mentored by him?
It was too amazing, because to me he's you know, I was only in his presence physically one time.
Oh.
But I first contacted him in, I think, 2004, because and he died in, I think, 2009. And when I first contacted him, because I personally was so impressed with niacin, I was taking it all the time. And then I decided that I need to make sure this is good for me. You know, I had read that it corrects all the blood lipids perfectly, but it does this. And then my peers were saying, like, that can't be good for you, or, you know, when I'm flushing red or something. I had to figure it out. And so I had my own lab, and I started to just choose to go in that direction. I had liberty to do so. And I contacted him after I found him, that this guy, Abram Hoffer, had been treating thousands of patients, and this whole story blew up in my face. And at the same time, the whole NAD story was blowing up with David Sinclair at Harvard, head of genetics now, I think.
He talks about longevity, doesn't he?
Yeah, he was doing longevity research in yeast, and he at the time did a big small molecule screen and identified a NAD utilizing sirtuin gene as being central to caloric restriction dependent increases in lifespan. But to answer your question, Abram Hoffer. So then we went back and forth, and he so generous with his clinical experience and the emails, you know, so generous. I wasn't used to it, because I was in academia where a lot of people hold their cards tight, and he was just wide open and critical, and just straight to the point. You know, sometimes in academia, people could be a little bit too long-winded, you know, or whatever. They're trying to sound a certain way. He was a real person that just went straight to the concerns of the patient, and he had so many stories, and he introduced me to different books to read that I read, and then I sort of ended up with that 2007 publication I wrote that was the culmination of what he put in my mind, and also my wife had some input there too.
Because he was very focused on psychiatry, or this integrative approach to psychiatry. I mean, he really wrote the book on it, more or less, didn't he?
Yeah, and he was such an inspiration for discovery. Like, I think a lot of people that go into science or medicine, they're not so they don't have the belief at all that things can be so simple, but they can. And I think Abram just knocks it out of the park with what I summarize as: you should fix the human body machine with the molecular parts that it uses, not, some patented thing that we don't really know that much about, which is the cycle we're in right now that gets repeated.
It's interesting you should say that about him having such an open mind, because one of the themes that we've explored on this podcast is that it's good for practitioners to be skeptical and curious. But when I heard that statement, and that was shared by me from a professor of psychology, Julia Ruckledge, from New Zealand, and she said it's really important for doctors to be skeptical and curious. And when she said that, I thought, okay, that's interesting. At which point in a doctor's education does that curiosity kick in? Like for me, we did our undergraduate work on anatomy, physiology, biochemistry in the early years of our degree, and we just couldn't wait to get those subjects out of the way until we started to learn the really important stuff, like pathology and pharmacology. This is where we were being real people, real doctors, So the curiosity, I think, for many medical practitioners and so-called experts seems to have only kicked in their medical education from the moment they were able to pick up, I've got it right next to me here, a prescription pad, So that's, if I've got show me where the next drug is coming from, show me where the next whiz-bang science is coming from. Don't bore me with the details of my early undergraduate training, whereas in fact, it was that early undergraduate training that held all the keys.
Yeah. I mean,
and this is what you're saying. Abram Hoffer was curious, was open-minded all his life. Incredible.
His story is just too amazing. His life story. There's a book that everybody should read. I feel like it's called Adventures in Psychiatry, and it's a autobiography. It's like not enough people know about it, and the short version of his life story was basically he was raised on a farm in the middle of Canada, so that gives you a ridiculous strong work ethic. And then he was a biochemist first, and he was with some Indians on a reservation trying to tell people they need this level of fortification, and they wouldn't listen to him. So he had that work ethic. So he went back to med school and said he needed to become an MD. So he did it, and then he was quickly put in charge of a big hospital of an asylum for people with mental health issues in Saskatchewan. And then he realized that these people with health issues, with the mental issues, they resembled the peregrines, the vitamin B3 or niacin deficient individuals that he had seen on the Indian reservation. So he thought, what, maybe these people need a much higher amount of niacin. And then he basically proved that's the case. The schizophrenics, they don't flush as much on average. There's even a test marketed now for that, a skin test. And eventually when they recover, they begin to flush. And he asked Merck for niacin. He got a whole oil drum full of niacin powder, and he tried all these doses. And he found that if they were not, schizophrenic for a really long time, like years. Those people sometimes were not reachable, but he was able to, cure and recover a lot of them. And in the end, one of the last publications after maybe 50 years of medical practice and like 10,000 patients, many with high dose niacin, he published a paper with Jonathan Prowsky at the end of near the end of his life in about 2009, roughly, where they said that there are people who require as much as 16 grams of niacin a day. And it's they take it always in divided doses, whether it's 3 times a day, 4 or 5 times a day, or whatever. But there's some people because it's real interesting if people that understand the central dogma, molecular biology, that a protein makes RNA and all that stuff. We can look at the sequence of all the genes, and we can see which proteins have a NAD binding domain. And there are now a number of genes where we can see that they have a different amino acid substitution in that NAD binding domain. So those enzymes, proteins, whatever the type of protein it is, they need more NAD than the average person. So that means what I'm saying in a long way is that there's individuals that they require higher levels of NAD for the protein to serve its function, and when we talk about NAD, it's involved in over 400 gene functions. So the implications are vast. It's involved in more functions than any other vitamin the vitamin B3. The only thing more than niacin, NAD, is magnesium. Well, the minerals are different, but because magnesium's like 800 genes, so magnesium's,
Now, Todd, we've had Carol and Dean on last year, and she's part of that. We had her back on the summer series because I wanted to replay that, because I think magnesium, you touched on it there too, is such a big one. It's so important. I mean, we hear a lot about vitamin D being important, but without magnesium, it's not going to happen. We hear a lot about calcium being important, but without magnesium, that's not going to happen, not as it should anyway. And here you are throwing up B3, because we've done programs, of course, with Andrew Saul and with Richard Chen, and talking about vitamin C. But, I guess the point about all of this, which kind of people might listen and go, now, hang on, what is it? Is it B3? Is it magnesium? Is it C? Is it D? Is it zinc? Is it this? It's that. It's all of those things. That's what makes the human body work. Not one drug versus a placebo.
Yeah, you need all of them to fire on all cylinders to have you got an eight reaction pathway. The reaction from tryptophan to NAD is like something like 8 reactions. It requires B1, C, magnesium, glutamine, and then some B6, and probably a bunch more. I don't know, maybe zinc. If you got to have all of them. So yeah.
And how could you possibly do a randomized, which brings us back to one of our first questions, is how does one do a double-blinded randomized controlled trial on any one of those components? It's just an absurd model, which is being perpetuated as the gold standard. Tell me, just taking a step back, with what are your observations about how the pandemic is being managed? And I don't mind you being controversial, Todd. It's okay. No one's listening. It's just you and me.
Yeah, I know. That's painfully evident. I'm in a state that, my country has become so political. Farcical with the last president, that even when he's right, about something, then, you just get thrown into these groups, when you have an opinion. So it's not even some of these topics like the vaccine, I can't even talk about it around a lot of people.
Yeah.
But so there's that. But what's really heartbreaking to me is to me it looks like Dr. Shankara Chatty. I don't know if you saw all that stuff.
No, I didn't.
Oh, you didn't?
No, go on, tell me.
So our friend in our group, Dr. Karen Musterjan, the Finnish.
Oh, yes. Sorry, no, did see that trial. But go on, share with us a little bit about that story.
Yeah, this blows my mind. He's treated literally thousands of patients in South Africa, and usually historically the biggest discoveries in medicine are in places like war zones and South Africa. I'm imagining, you're a dentist, and they made some of the best surgical developments because they had to work with what they got in a war zone. And this guy, anyways, he's done thousands and he's successful all the time with COVID. And Todd, he's in that orthomolecular news service group, of which there are 50 plus people. No, he's not.
No,
he's not in the group. He was somebody. I can send you the link. Shankara Chatty. He's a physician in South Africa, and I've only seen his one presentation, and I thought it was incredible. It was hosted by a Swedish doctor, and on her show, and I can send it to you later.
Yeah.
But he says that the reason we're completely failing in stopping this, because he's got like 100% success at this point after treating, he says, 8,000 patients. He says the reason we're failing for this is because the diagnosis isn't even right. He says the first 8 days are a viral pneumonia, yes, but then, and most recover, but then the next phase that will kill people very quickly if they're unfortunately susceptible is an allergic reaction. And as we know, with food allergies and all kinds of things, you can have allergic reactions that repeat themselves for a long time, like with long COVID. But the fact that it happens so fast is consistent to me with the idea that it's an allergic reaction. So what he's been doing is treating it with an antihistamine. And he uses promethazine and montelukast, which is actually a leukotriene inhibitor that is commonly used with antihistamines. And honestly, about 2 weeks ago, my own wife had COVID, and she had 103-degree temperature. Her chest was tightening. And I just had learned, thanks to Karen, about this antihistamine, the fact that it's the mast cells degranulating and releasing massive amounts of histamine and other mediators that can quickly kill people, like just very quickly. So we gave my wife had COVID, and I just went and got the antihistamine we had, which was Claritin. The active ingredient is loratadine, and the most common antihistamine is
Claritin's a pretty common one too, though, isn't it?
I'm blanking now. I think I'm blanking on what the active ingredient is for Benadryl, but Benadryl is another very common antihistamine. And honestly, I personally absolutely believe, because he saw really reproducibly, he sees recoveries, very dramatic recoveries with antihistamines. So I tell my friends, put it in your medicine cabinet so that because everybody, so many people I know, they get COVID, they get it again. And when you're at that height of feeling horrible, try the antihistamine, because this guy, it really works over and over again. And yeah.
Yeah, well, it's been a very frustrating time to be in healthcare, to really see how this whole discussion, and there hasn't really been a discussion about how best to approach this. Sadly, I think public health is a long way down the list of priorities in this pandemic. I mean, that sounds a crazy thing to say, but I think it is actually true that we haven't really put it as the high, because I actually saw this pandemic as an opportunity to really focus on health. I mean, we knew about comorbidities being more susceptible, and so we had a global audience focused on health like never before. And what an opportunity that was to improve health. And
yeah, you would think.
You would think.
I mean, we got the easiest communication right now with the internet.
Yeah.
The whole world's connected, but the problem is we're distracted. Everybody just doesn't even have time. They got social media, or they don't know, whatever. I mean, I think that's something. I think that's part of it. And then it's also the profit motive does not belong at all in any medicine. But yeah, that's just my philosophy.
Yeah, no. Todd, thanks for joining us today and sharing some of those insights. And I'd love to have a copy of that 2007 paper that you wrote as a summary of your time with Abram Hoffer, because I think, that's such an important, he had such an important contribution. And it's been great to talk today. So thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you too much for the wonderful questions. And I'll send that and Dr. Shankar Chatty link, and also the book by Abram Hoffer.
Fantastic. Thank you, Todd.
Okay, thank you.
Well, we covered some territory there, and may have been a little challenging keeping up, but I think essentially what was so interesting to hear about Dr. Abram Hoffer, which is a name you may not have heard, but he is most certainly one of the pioneers of integrative psychiatry. And this follows on really a discussion that we had some months ago with Julia Ruckledge, who's a professor of psychology at Christchurch University, and she's written a book called The Better Brain, which is all about using nutrients to treat psychological problems, and of which schizophrenia is one, but of course there are many others as well. And it was so interesting to hear that story about Tecfidera, because it is a model for how modern medicine is approached. And it's, on the one hand, we have a patentable drug which has side effects, and because of its new nature, it is put out there, and any long-term effects will eventually become apparent to those that have taken it and paid for it. And eventually many of these drugs end up being withdrawn. One thing you can always say about things like vitamin D, vitamin C, vitamin E, magnesium, zinc, calcium, B group vitamins, is they are part of the human body. So it's very unlikely that you will ever hear that they will be withdrawn from use, because the body requires so many of them to function optimally. And in fact, I think it's interesting to reflect on how this pandemic has been managed. I think it's an opportunity here. I have currently identified 5 or 6 Ps that characterize this pandemic. And one of those Ps is profit, another is politics, another is power, another is patents, of which try Tecfidera or Molnupiravir or Resdimivir. These are all patentable drugs, and you will hear a lot of these being championed, of course, whereas you will hear very little about those drugs that are off patent and are literally worth just a few cents each tablet. They're of no interest to our public health authorities. And the irony is that so many people have become marketing and compliance officers for Big Pharma, which has repeatedly been shown to be guilty of fraud and illegal marketing, but I digress. back onto my discussion with Todd, he is part of that orthomolecular news service, and Abram Hoffer, who literally is a legend, the father of that. And I'm looking forward to getting Todd's 2007 article that he wrote, which summarized so many of his dealings with Abram Hoffer. And also to remind me of, and you, I hope, of another nutrient which is important and has incredible potential to correct biochemical imbalances which lead to chronic degenerative diseases, which we know now as comorbidities. And B3 is one of those. And the flush that he's talking about is literally, as we said, the flush of your face, and to find and to spread out doses over a day, and to get that flush reflex. Well, I'm going to really explore that again. I think that was really interesting. So I'll have links to that article, which Todd referenced. He also talked about histamine. Now, this was another very interesting thing. On our orthomolecular news service group, Shankar Chaudhry is not on that group, but he was, that physician was referenced because Todd's wife had contracted COVID, and Todd was seeking advice from the orthomolecular group. And this is where this idea that, and I hadn't heard this before, so I'm definitely going to be exploring this, that there is an allergic response amongst the plethora of responses that occur in this pandemic with COVID-19, and the use of antihistamines. Now, he mentioned promethazine, but clonidine or Benadryl are also more common antihistamines, and that was used successfully. And this Dr. Chaudhry has used this approach on thousands in South Africa successfully. I think it's interesting to actually reflect on countries like South Africa and India. Remember, the Delta variant came from India, and you would have thought such a virulent variant would have caused absolute devastation in India. And of course, the response by our so-called experts in our Western world is, oh, well, they're not reporting deaths, or, they're just not reporting what's going on. Well, I would have thought the perfect story, which any pharmaceutical company and any newspaper who seem to be the voices of pharmaceutical companies. So I would have thought The Guardian or the Sydney Morning Herald or the New York Times or the Washington Post, all who are running stories on behalf of the pharmaceutical industry, I would have thought they could have easily sent reporters to India to report on the sheer devastation that the Delta variant has had on this non-vaccinated country. And it would have made incredibly compelling material for marketing the vaccine even more than it is currently being marketed. So it's an open country. You could have gone to South Africa or India, and any of those newspapers could have sent reporters to report on it. But funnily enough, we haven't heard about it. And why is that? Why are these developing countries that don't have a lot of money to spend hundreds of billions of dollars on vaccination programs and are left with off-market drugs like ivermectin or hydroxychloroquine or zinc, or an antibiotic like azithromycin or doxycycline, or a histamine like Benadryl or chloroquine, all really, really cheap interventions. That's what they're stuck with, if you like. That's what they're able to use, all they're able to use. And hey, guess what? They haven't had millions of deaths, which you would have thought they would have had, because, hey, guess what? They haven't been vaccinated to the same degree that we have in the West. Aren't we lucky in the West to have enough money to pay for all of these vaccines and to be able to afford all these new patentable drugs, which are yet to be proven and may one day be withdrawn because of their side effects? But this is an example, and it was so interesting to hear Todd draw on that example of multiple sclerosis and Tecfidera, $5,000 a month versus Niacin, $5 a month, and Tecfidera has been removed for all sorts of side effects. Look, this is a story about the science in medicine. And I think the way we have approached this pandemic is a good example of how we've approached chronic diseases. It's all about a pharmaceutical approach, long-term management, lots of profits. It's one reason why the pharmaceutical industry now generates something like $1.2 trillion a year in profit, in revenue. That's what it does. And blockbuster drugs are those drugs that earn the company more than $1 billion a year. They're a huge deal for a drug company. To land a blockbuster drug that generates $1 billion a year is something that is really important. For a drug company, well, Pfizer has generated $33 billion in its first year with the vaccine. So do the maths on that. Anyway, I will have links to Todd's articles. Hope this finds you well. Until next time, this is Dr. Ron Ehrlich.
This podcast provides general information and discussion about medicine, health, and related subjects. The content is not intended and should not be construed as medical advice or as a substitute for care by a qualified medical practitioner. If you or any other person has a medical concern, he or she should consult with an appropriately qualified medical practitioner. Guests who speak in this podcast express their own opinions, experiences, and conclusions.